So Jane Hamilton, welcome to Crime World. Delighted to have you on to tell this story of your new book, which is called My Mother's Murder. And you've written the book with Gina McGavin, whose mum, Mary, was killed many years ago in Glasgow. Now, I suppose we'll start really with Mary and a little bit of background about her. Who was she and where did she come from?
So Mary was born in Partick. She lived her whole life there, actually, born and died there. Her initial first 5 years were perfect. She had a mum and a dad who absolutely adored her. Unfortunately, Mary's mum, Kathleen, passed away when Mary was only 5. Her dad was a merchant seaman, and, in 1920s Glasgow, men just did not look after their children. They were the providers, and the women did all the work. So Mary was shipped off to live with 2 aunts, and they weren't very particularly happy about having another child foisted onto them, another mouth to feed. Life was difficult in 1920s Glasgow, a lot of poverty. So she didn't have a great life. She wasn't nurtured. She wasn't particularly loved. And the only time she would get a bit of affection was when her dad would, come and visit when he was back home. And that wasn't enough for Mary. She was a happy little soul. Everybody who remembers Mary, family members, told us that she was a happy wee thing. Despite she felt like Cinderella, basically, because, she was having to do lots of cooking, cleaning, things that children just shouldn't be doing at 5 and 6 years old. It was just a horrible start for her life. She missed her mum dreadfully. She didn't understand why her daddy wouldn't, look after her. And I think that sort of sowed the seeds for Mary's later life, because she didn't know how to nurture, because she wasn't nurtured herself. So she married Joe Mullen when she was quite young. And the story that Gina was always told by her mum was that Joe wasn't Mary's first love, and her first love was actually a man named John, who she was had been friends with as a child and was her teenage sweetheart. But John wouldn't marry her, and when he went off to war, she married Joe Mullen instead. It wasn't a love match, and she ended up having 6 children with him. And she left when her youngest, Marie, was just a matter of months old. She just walked out the door, and that was it. The kids didn't really see her very much after that.
And was she a young mum when she was having these children? Was she in her 20s?
Yeah, she was. She started quite young. I think she had her first daughter, Kathleen, who she obviously named after her mum. She had her when she was just, in her late teens, early 20s. So, it was quite difficult to go from, not knowing how to look after a family to suddenly having all these children running about. And, she was a bit of a party animal. She did enjoy going out, having a drink. She was very sociable. So it was maybe, a difficult thing for her to, comprehend and deal with. And of course, as I've said already, back in those days, men were the providers and women, were expected to stay at home, cook, clean and look after the kids, and that just didn't suit Mary's personality at all.
So having left her first husband and the 6 children, and we'll come back to obviously all this, but she actually then got back with the original love of her life who'd gone to war.
Yeah, she met John, and she went back with him, and they went on to have 5 more children. The relationship, she was deeply, deeply in love with John. John was the love of her life. But the relationship was, I think, quite not violent, but, it could be a little bit icky at times. They had some very passionate fights, shall we say. So, but eventually that relationship broke down as well. And, John was left with the kids again. So, all 11 children were basically... she would flit in and out of their lives. She did have some good relationships with some of the children. Some of them she was quite close to, and they would see her a lot more than the others. But the younger ones, she didn't see very much of them, particularly Gina and Marie. They didn't see Mary often at all, and were brought up by their dad.
So by 1984, the year she dies, Mary is 58 years of age. She's living in Scotland, in Glasgow still, and she's kind of in a bad place. She's separated from two husbands. She's got 11 children. Now, when I say children, she's 58 at this stage. So her eldest daughter, Kathleen, who she named after her own mother, is coming on 40 nearly. So she's at, they're well adults, but so she's kind of living a lifestyle that she's going out. She's spending a lot of time in the pub. She's just one of those sort of tragic individuals that has had a hard life and has created a huge amount of children and family there. Presumably there was no contraception available in these days. They're very different times, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, it was, yeah.
So what's happening with her around this time, around 1984?
So in 1984, she did actually have a partner, Terry McLaughlin. They didn't marry. She took Terry's name, though, which is how she's come to be known as Mary McLaughlin, because she used his name. But Terry was a merchant seaman, strangely enough. That seemed to be kind of a sort of fixture in her life. You know, the men would be working away quite a lot. So he was away in September 1984, but she would socialise in her local pub every night. She was there. She would play dominoes. She'd go for a drink. She didn't like to be in the house. And if she was in the house, she would quite often have people around to play dominoes and, smoke and have a drink. And that was probably the extent of her social life. And like I say, she would flit in and out of her adult children's lives and, see her grandchildren now and again. Who all thought she was this, great, funny wee lady, because she did have a great sense of humour. She was very funny. She was very lovable with them when she did see them. She had a great personality. So she was out, and she would go out with Kathleen, the oldest daughter, quite a lot. And Kathleen was actually with her mum on the night she was last seen alive. And she left her mum and went home. And we know that Mary left not long after, and she told the barman that she was going to do her usual. She was going to stop for fritters, which is sort of like fried potatoes. That they were quite common in chip shops at that time. So she would go for fritters, and she was going to get a packet of cigarettes, and she was going to go home. And so she said, cheerio, everybody, I'll see you tomorrow. Everybody knew her as Wee Mary. Mm-hmm. So she was quite a well-known face in Partick, just because of her personality. She had such a, despite her horrible start in life, she had such a personality. She was quite bubbly, and she would laugh a lot and would crack a lot of jokes, basically to hide a lot of the pain. Gina's always said to me that her mum wore a painted smile, because she would hold it in and hide what she was really feeling and just try and be the life and soul of the party. So she was seen walking along Dumbarton Road, and a taxi driver saw her. She walked across the front of his car, and she had her shoes in her hand, so she was obviously barefoot. She wasn't, 3 sheets to the wind, but she'd had a couple of drinks, but she could, that was nothing unusual. She could handle that, no problem. She went into the chip shop, she cracking jokes with the staff as usual. She used to love it when they would tell her good night in Italian. Every night she would get them to say good night to her in Italian. And she bought her cigarettes and she bought her fritters. And unfortunately, that was the last time Mary was seen alive. What happened next is only known to the man who would eventually be convicted of her murder. We don't know whether he's been in the pub and spotted Mary, or if he's followed her from the street. We know that he did. She was seen being followed by a passerby. But where he first came into contact with Mary is totally unknown.
And I suppose before we get on to this man, because it's some years before he actually is identified as a suspect, what occurs? When is Mary found, and how big sort of a news story is this at that time?
So she was last seen on the 28th of September, and on the 6th of October, her son Martin, they were, he would visit his mum maybe once or twice a week, and he hadn't heard from her in a week, which was quite unusual at that time. So he decided that he was going to go to Crathy Court where she lived to see what was going on. And it could have been that she'd done another one of her disappearing acts, because quite often she did sometimes just disappear and go and stay with one of her children and not tell the others. But when Martin got there, from accounts that he's given, he said that there was a foul smell coming from inside. And when he looked through the letterbox, they could smell it. So he kicked the door in. Mary's neighbour did have a key. And he had said to Martin that he hadn't seen Mary for a few days, but he didn't think anything of it because, again, she was used to just disappearing. But they couldn't get his key to work. For some reason, the killer had locked the mortise lock and taken the Yale key, and the keys were never found. So they had to kick the door in, and of course they were confronted with this horrific scene. Mary was lying on her bed. She had been undressed. That evening, the last evening that she had gone out, she'd worn a new dress that she had, which has always made Gina suspicious, made her think that maybe her mum was planning to meet somebody, go on a date, because it was quite an expensive dress. It was pretty. It was something that she wouldn't wear just to go down to the pub to play dominoes with. That dress was lying on top of Mary's body, back to front. It was like the killer had decided to just place it on top of her. The flat was in a bit of a disarray. There was lots of there was a half game of dominoes set up on the table. Cans of alcohol. It was a bit of a mess, and obviously decomposition had started to set in with Mary. So it was an absolutely horrific sight for a son to discover.
And Jane, had she been sexually assaulted? You said she was unclothed somewhat, but what could they see had happened?
The postmortem wasn't clear on that because of the decomposition of her body, but the supposition has always been that it was a sexually motivated attack. She was 58 years old. She wouldn't have been any match for a younger man. So that's always been that it was sexually motivated. What we know about her killer now would suggest that Mary probably did suffer some sort of sex attack.
I suppose at the crime scene, police found, and took whatever they could back in the 1980s. Forensics and DNA has developed, obviously, but one of the things that was kept over the years as some evidence was a stub of a cigarette found in an ashtray, which wasn't her cigarettes, the Woodbine ones she smoked. It was another type of a cigarette. It was sort of kept all these years in the as part of the evidence.
Yeah, I mean, in 1984, there wasn't, the modern murder investigations that we have nowadays. We rely quite heavily on DNA. And while DNA can place you at the scene of a crime, it can't actually say that you did it. So, thankfully, the original inquiry team, scenes of crimes officers, had the presence of mind to preserve what they could from that scene, because back in 1984, all you had was blood typing and fingerprints. And DNA would be another, 4 years or so before it was used for the first time down in England. But they had the presence of mind to preserve that. And thankfully, in the intervening 30 years, that's DNA, that evidence was not lost by the police, because we do know that Strathclyde police did lose lots of other items of evidence in other cases over the years. Police stations close, boxes get moved, that sort of thing. People don't pay much attention. But that was all preserved. And when I came to the case in 2016, there had been 4 reviews on Mary's death. And the original inquiry team were on a hiding to nothing. They had met a wall of silence. There were no witnesses. Nobody heard anything in the flat. There was no screams. There was no banging doors. A couple of witnesses saw her walking along the street, thought she was perhaps being followed by somebody. There was a description of a young man with a scar down his face. the inquiry team originally, they threw a dragnet round Partick, and they did, truly work hard to try and solve Mary's murder at that point, but they were hampered by so much. And, there was a lot of, they pulled in, sex offenders, known sex offenders, housebreakers. They were, at one point they did surmise that maybe she disturbed a burglar trying to, rob her house.
But Jen, you paint a very good picture of her. You've a certain intimacy with her, even though you don't come along to the case until far later. But she's obviously a popular person, and I imagine that as police are, appealing for information, those who know her are helpful coming forward and trying to, give as much as possible about her last movements. But clearly none of those witnesses have actually seen anything that is tangible for the police.
No, there was nothing concrete. And, she was found on October the 6th, and by February, the police had to wind the case down. They had to all be reassigned to other cases. And that was it. And like I say, after that, there were 4 other separate reviews, into Mary's murder. And again, each time there was just, there was nothing. There was no new witnesses. There was no new information. Police were hoping that maybe with the passage of time, that, anybody that did know anything, allegiances change over the years, that anybody that did know anything might have come forward, but there was just absolutely nothing. It was just like a dead wall of silence.
And the other thing, talk to us a little bit at this stage about Gina, who's one of the 11 children of Mary McLaughlin, as she was when she was murdered. Where does Gina come in the family, and what age was she when her mother died?
So Gina was 30 when her mum was murdered, and she had not long been married herself. She had 2 little girls, and she was just starting to reconcile with her mum. She would see her mum in the book. She does talk quite frankly about the times that, her and her mum met. And she's honest, to say, I didn't know my mum very well because we didn't see each other very often. Gina was the second youngest to Joe Mullen, the first husband.
Okay.
And Marie was the baby. So, and she's quite graphic in, in what she was telling me about her early life, her meeting her own husband and how, that transpired, and her relationship with her mum. And what's glaring, and from the book, is how little she actually did know her mother. When I first met Gina in 2016, what struck me was the absolute rawness of the pain that was coming from her. It was coming through in waves. And I was always sort of baffled, you didn't really know this woman so well, why are you so affected by her death? And she just looked at me and she said, because she was my mum and she didn't deserve to die the way she did. So, it's really sad. The book, it's not a happy book.
Yeah.
It's very raw. It's truthful. She doesn't shy away from anything. She wanted her mum to have a voice. And, when I started to look at the case, I'd been asked to do an unsolved murder series for the Daily Record newspaper in Glasgow. And what struck me was the lack of headlines about Mary. There was just virtually nothing. There was no front pages. Nobody, kicking up a stink about her. Gina had tried over the years to get journalists interested. And she did, get a couple of stories in newspapers, and journalists would promise her there. So, of course, when I doorstepped her, she wasn't particularly happy to see me. She was like, oh, no, not another sell your granny for a story reporter. But for whatever reason, she decided to trust me that day. And, we're 10 years down the line, nearly. And none of us had any idea at that time, what kind of journey we were going to be going on.
So that stage, 2016, when you're looking to do a story about this unsolved murder, is the 4 reviews are complete. It's a cold case, isn't it? And there looks like as if nothing is coming to the fore. But what is going on in the background with science and with the investigation team and that cigarette butt we talked about?
Yeah, so unknown to us, we did the story in the Daily Record, and it landed, and it landed where it mattered, and forensic scientists were interested in the case. And unknown to us, Police Scotland had already started another review of Mary's murder, and Joanne Cochrane, who a forensic scientist with the patience of an absolute saint, decided that she was going to have a look at all the productions, because Scotland does use the most advanced DNA techniques in the UK. We use DNA 24, which is able to look for 24 markers. Previously, we only had, DNA 18, which wasn't good enough to, show up any low copy DNA or, any body fluids. So Joanne, she managed to get a profile from the cigarette butt, which had been retrieved from the scene of the crime in Mary's flat. It was being discarded. And she also had the presence of mind to look at the ligature that was used to strangle Mary. And there was a knot in this dressing gown cord. It was Mary's own dressing gown cord, and the killer had tied a knot, and that's to give him greater strength to pull. Joanne decided that she was going to unravel this knot and see if there was a slight possibility that there might have been some DNA from the killer inside the actual knot. So she did that, and that's what she did. She took it apart piece by piece, strand by strand, fibre by fibre, and I understand that it took a very long time, weeks if not months, because she didn't want to run the risk of destroying any material that was, within this knot. And lo and behold, they got a hit on the DNA database, which surprised everybody.
And that was on from the knot of the dressing gown rope, plus from the cigarette butt.
Yeah, they had a DNA profile from the cigarette, but the cigarette wouldn't have been enough for a conviction. They needed more. They needed to place him. He could have written that off as, well, yeah, I had a cigarette and I left. She was still alive when I left. They needed to prove not only that he was in Mary's flat, but also how could his DNA land on the murder weapon, and particularly inside an intricate knot, which, he's left fluid from his body or skin, fibres from his body. So, that places him with the murder weapon. And they needed that. The cigarette was never going to... The cigarette butt was the first eureka moment for the police, but it was never going to be enough for a conviction. It was never going to be enough to take him to court, which is why Joanne moved on to the knot.
So we talk about him. So who is he, and who is this suspect that they've identified?
So the suspect that they identified at the time was a man named Graham McGill. And Graham McGill, there's not an awful lot known about him. We don't focus a lot on him in the book because we wanted it to be about Mary. But he was a convicted sex offender. And in 1984, Graham McGill had been serving a 6-year sentence for a previous sex attack on a woman. And unfortunately for Mary, Graham McGill was on day release from prison when he murdered her. What's always been a mystery for Gina is why Graham McGill, at 22 years old, in prison in Edinburgh, travelled 60 miles to Partick, which is not the centre of Glasgow. So it's not where, people would go for a night out, to go heading east to west. Partick was, a sort of village. Gina's always, it's always tormented her. Why did he travel all those miles on a bus, on public transport, when he had 2 days left to enjoy of his freedom before he had to go back to prison? Why did he travel all those miles to Glasgow, and why did he target my mum? So we know that he was out on day release, and unfortunately for the original inquiry team, they were never going to solve it at the time because nobody would have thought to have looked at Edinburgh prison for prisoners that were off on training for freedom, as they called it at that point. So McGill...
So while they were trawling, I suppose, lists of sex offenders living in the area, he was just so random and he was also supposed to be serving a prison term. So, and he takes a bus in from such a distance. It's very, very random.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't the communication there is nowadays between agencies and, prison and police and social work. And, you don't have that interagency communication in 1984. So they were looking at the local area. They're not thinking 60 miles down the road in the capital city. They were never going to do it. They would pull in local sex offenders and just... It was a difficult one,
So it was December of 2019 when Graham McGill was arrested, then 59 years of age. He'd been 22, I think, at the time that Mary was murdered. So what happens in the preceding years?
So unfortunately, COVID hit in 2020 and his trial kept getting put back. Gina was desperate for info at this point because this was a name that wasn't known to her. She was shocked. I remember speaking to her on the day McGill was arrested and charged, and she was just absolutely stunned by what they knew, even more so by the fact that he was a stranger, because she had spent so many years convinced that, somebody in the family had been responsible for her mother's death. He went on trial in 2021 eventually, and was found guilty thanks to the presence of the DNA. But the police did hit a stumbling block in their investigation. And that stumbling block was that Graham McGill had an alibi for the night Mary was murdered. He told them when he was pulled in for interview, I couldn't have murdered her because I was inside. And when they checked the prison records, it was true. Graham McGill was registered as being a prisoner at Edinburgh Prison, Stockton Prison as it was called then. So we've got his DNA on the dressing gown. We've got his DNA on the cigarette butt. So we know he was there that night. But the official records are telling us that this man was in prison for rape 60 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
So the cold case team were, scratching their heads. They were like, he's got a solid alibi. We're never getting this past a jury. And thankfully, they didn't give up. And it was a boots on the ground approach. It wasn't just DNA as a Hail Mary. They needed to go back to old school policing, and old fashioned detective inquiry. So one of the officers went to Edinburgh Prison and he looked in the archives. And in the archives, he managed to dig up the governor's logbook, which was all written by hand at the time. You didn't have computers or iPads and all that sort of stuff. So he found the governor's logbook, and inside the logbook was an entry that said Graham McGill, the dates, and it said TFF, and TFF meant Training for Freedom. That was the real eureka moment for the police, because then they knew they had him because he was out on day release. And that's how they were able to smash his alibi, Basically, yeah, you might have been in prison, but you weren't actually in prison on those nights.
Extraordinary stuff, extraordinary story. So he basically was jailed. Ultimately, the jury returned a unanimous verdict after his trial, and he was jailed for a minimum of 14 years, backdated until the day he was arrested. But your book is really written about the effects of this crime and, how other people are affected, because you have this moment of violence when McGill, and only he can know what brought him on a bus and exactly what happened in those hours around Mary's death, how he lured his way into her apartment and what happened in there. But really, it's the effect of that death, that murder, and his actions on such a wider family, because it's like dropping a rock into the middle of a pool and those ripple effects keep going. So Gina, for example, you mentioned there that she suspected members of her own family of having involvement or covering up, and presumably that created very toxic relationships for her going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the family are quite fractured anyway. They don't see each other very often, and I think relationships have been quite difficult in the past. So Gina was quite close to a couple of her siblings. And I don't want to give away a spoiler, but there is a chapter dedicated to one of the siblings that Gina suspected knew a lot more about her mother's murder than she's let on. Murder, there's more than one victim when you have a murder like this.
And does Gina still believe that today, or is she of the opinion now that this sort of, I suppose, mysterious man came out of nowhere and was responsible for it?
No, and she does. We do touch on it in the book. Gina hoped that the book would give her peace, and a word that we both hate, closure, because you're never going to get closure when something like this. She has spent almost over half her life looking for her mum's killer, and it still dominates today. She's given her mum a voice, because we wanted it to be about Mary and about the effects that murder has on families and people. But does it give her a sense of closure in terms of the right man is in prison? Yes, the right man is in prison, but she doesn't believe that he acted alone, and nothing will ever dissuade Gina of that. She firmly believes that McGill was in Partick for a reason. He was drawn to Partick for a reason. He was introduced to her mother for a reason. He told his ex-wife that he'd murdered a woman because he wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody. And, Gina firmly believes that something drew him to Partick, and that something is somebody that was close to her, and that Mary possibly knew. There are a couple of, shocking revelations in the book that I'm not going to go into here. And it does throw up a lot of questions, but the police are satisfied. They've got their man. He's serving a life sentence. If he does get out, he's going to be incredibly old. So, they've got justice. But in terms of justice for Gina, that's just not happened.
And what drew you that deep into the story? There's a big difference between writing a story for your newsroom and writing a book. What was it that really, kept you kind of going on the story? Was it the intrigue of the forensics, the science, the solving of this unsolvable case, or was it the relationship you developed with Gina?
I'm going to be really honest. When I was doing the Unsolved Murder series, I wasn't that focused on Mary McLaughlin's story. I wanted to do it because I felt enraged that there was so little about her and she'd basically been forgotten. But there was another case that was catching my eye from 1968. And I actually went on to solve that one. But that was taking my attention. And, the Mary McLaughlin case, we did a good story on it and it looked great in the paper, and it landed where we wanted it to land. But it was, maybe a year or so before I spoke to Gina again after that. She had messaged me about something. She wanted to tell me something. And, we developed our relationship from that. She trusted me enough to confide in me that her thoughts on her mum's murder weren't as cut and dried as, she was make out in public. She was determined that somebody in her family was involved or knew a lot more than they had let on. And I kept, for years, I kept saying to her, you can't, these people are still alive. You can't accuse people of murder just like that. But, anyway, she said to me after the trial that she was going to try and self-publish a book. And I said to her, okay, send it to me and I'll have a look at it for you, thinking that I would just score out some legal thing. You can't say that, you can't say this. And then it just transpired into more, and I found that, I was taking big chunks of what she had written and I was changing it. And then we obviously got the book deal with Mirror Books, and they asked me to write it completely afresh, start again, do it fresh. And the hardest part for me was, you're a journalist too. We've got to write in such a matter-of-fact way. We've got to, we're straight down the middle. We're impartial. It's not our opinion. And it's not our voice. So we're kind of, experienced in that we're not writing in our own voices. So I had to find Gina's voice and I had to write as if it was her voice. And, I think after 9 years, we kind of sort of knew each other well enough that I could do that. When we had the book launch a couple of weeks ago, she actually said in public, and I didn't think that she would, but she said, oh, the book process was really difficult. And Jane and I, at times, I thought we were going to kill each other, because, it was difficult. It's a hard process for me as a journalist to really drill down into what she was really thinking and feeling, because it's more than just 1,000-word spread. We're looking at a 288-page book. So, I had to really push her at times to give me more, because we needed to,
And look, the book, one way or another, it's been released on July 3rd. It's available now in bookshops and online, published by Mirror Books. It is giving, I suppose, Gina finally something that she has. Her mother was taken from her at a time, really, that she was seeing an opportunity to build bridges with her. She probably grew up feeling she had no mother, and now she was, finally getting an opportunity, or had matured herself to accept some of her mother's failings and to kind of go forward and build a relationship with her. And that was taken from her. Yeah. So the story is finally sort of getting the outing that she wishes. And it's interesting to see how the effects of murder are just far more than just on the victim, really.
Yeah. I mean, murder affects, there are more than one victim in every murder. You've got the family, a friend, it affects everybody. There's a ripple effect. And the murderer doesn't just take one life, and in this case, he's virtually robbed Gina and her siblings of 35 years of their lives. It's a very difficult thing to carry for so long. It's always there in the back of your mind. My mum died. Gina says in the book, you don't want to be telling people that your mum's been murdered, but I didn't think I'd spend 35 years saying that. And she, in one respect, she feels that she's given her mum a voice, and that's given her a semblance of peace. And she wanted to use that as a final sort of goodbye to her mum and to accept what's happened to her mum. But she said to me just recently, I still can't accept what happened to her. And I don't think I'll ever accept what happened to my mum. I've given her a voice. I've told her story, but I'm not going to find peace. And I've seen it over and over and over again. People talk about closure when it goes to court, and if, the perpetrator gets life or whatever their sentence is. People, you can have closure now, you can move on. In my experience, they can't move on. It's there every single day of every week and moment of their lives, and in Gina's case, she's 70 years old now, and she's not known a day's peace for the last 40 years, and it's horrific. But that's what she wanted to convey with the book. It's not just about the victim, it's about the ripple effect it has on everybody.
And the generations. Well, Jane Hamilton, crime reporter, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.